Margaret, do you think you discovered anything new on the dismissal? I know Mr. Fraser says this story's been done to death.
Well, I think there are
in book form and in the media.
I think there's some fresh insights on the dismissal, and just to answer your earlier question a little bit, the connection between the Gorton affair and the dismissal, I think if you look at the pattern of Malcolm's life, he's not a man who often decides that nothing is the right thing to do. And there was no reason for Australia to assert itself into South Africa and battle apartheid in the way it did during his government. And with Gough Whitlam, certainly it would have been possible for oppositions to do nothing or to do much less, but that's not the sort of pattern that Malcolm establishes, and you can see that in the Gorton affair as well. It would have been possible for Malcolm not to make a stand, and the whole history of that government and everything else would have been different, but also he would have been much diminished as a minister and as a politician. So very rarely has Malcolm decided that nothing is the right thing to do. He's an activist. I think I say it many times in the book, but he is an activist by nature and by politics. But what was the original question? It was...
Any new revelations?
I think...
Or do we know the story well enough? Do we think we know this story
I think the new...
This is the first time, obviously, that one of the principal players has got to put his version of events
That's right.
for the record, which
talked
is
about his
the value in it.
Before. I think the degree to which Malcolm knew John Kerr beforehand is something which has not been exactly a secret, but certainly not widely known.
Yeah.
That in fact, when Malcolm was Minister for Defence, he had appointed John Kerr to a very important inquiry into the pay of the armed services, and that had resulted, even after Malcolm's resignation, had resulted in meetings which were not exactly secret, but were also not public, between John Kerr and Malcolm, at which they'd talked about the finer points of this inquiry. And so there was an existing relationship of trust and cooperation between them, which of course Gough Whitlam didn't have, although he might have thought that he did. And I think that perhaps played into the crisis of 1975 in ways that hadn't been fully appreciated. So it's not earth-shattering or brand new information or anything, but perhaps a slightly new perspective.
Now, we're talking, obviously, in the transition to power, some very big decisions had to be taken straight off. And you mentioned in the book, and while we think back to the government just elected 2 years ago, confronting rather unusual international circumstances where we thought there might be a boom running one more year, or we thought maybe it was all going to end as it did a year later. This government, I think, regrets not going hard enough in its first budget. Mr. Fraser's made this point in the book that your first budget, the 76 budget, probably didn't cut deeply enough, notwithstanding the extraordinary expenditure of the Whitlam era. Programs that you were looking to cut in the first year, Whitlam programs, and the second year became programs that the coalition ministers wanted to own.
Well, there's a good deal of truth in that. I think it was a meeting in my office late in February of 76, because we had a mini budget before the budget proper, and we'd cut 500, 600 million. Now that's memory, which I haven't looked at the figures for a long while. Fred Wheeler said, look, you've done well enough. Philip Lynch and I, we'd asked him, have we gone far enough? We've done well enough, the economy has been through major shocks, you'll have another go later in the budget and another go. Now, it was much harder to cut later. I can remember telling Margaret Thatcher, when she first came into office, she said, you know, you've done it, Malcolm, have you got any advice? Cut harder than your Treasury pundits will advise. Otherwise, it will be harder to cut later on. And next time I saw her, she said, I wish I'd taken your advice. I didn't. And then all my ministers loved those programs, and it was much harder. So exactly the same thing happened there as happened in Australia.
And for all the focus on the economy around the time of the dismissal and the Fraser razor gangs, which some people will remember back to that day, that was very prominent in the media. The thing that's most remembered about your period, especially early in your first term, was another external shock, the steady increase in boat people from Vietnam. The then recently unified Vietnam under communist rule pretty much emptied the south of Vietnam of the people it didn't want to keep. and it imposed them on the region, and a lot of them came to Australia. Hard to imagine now, but when you look at the numbers of people who came in the second half of the 70s, it's double the rate of anything that we've experienced since, and for a much smaller population. It's the thing that both sides of politics look back on. One side now looks back on it and thinks, how could you have done it? The other side is amazed that the Conservative side of politics pulled it off. Maybe go through some of your thinking then, and maybe reflecting on the present debates that we're having on immigration.
It probably needs putting in perspective, because after the war, both major parties believed in the White Australia policy, and there was never really a formal declaration. The White Australia policy wasn't all that mentioned in Hubert Opperman's speech about 1966 or 7, which practically ended the White Australia policy and undid some legal remnants in 1972, which had no effect. But really, that policy had been unravelling through the 50s and 60s. If you like, from the moment Menzies signed on to the Refugee Convention in 1954. Now, both parties knew that race and religion were very sensitive issues in the body politic. Neither side was going to play politics with those subjects. So when they saw a relaxation in relation to the White Australia policy, the other side didn't get up and say, this is a terrible thing, you mustn't do it, we'll lose our whiteness or whatever. And there was a self-denying ordinance. Now allowing a lot of refugees from Indochina was totally consistent with the more gradual moves that had happened, but it wasn't a particularly gradual move, it was a very obvious upfront move. Gough Whitlam had originally made the decision not to allow refugees from Indochina into Australia, but when my government did, he never opposed it. He never tried to make it difficult from that point of view, and it would have obviously been very much more difficult if the Labour Party had played politics with race or religion the way it has been in more recent times. But that made the introduction of refugees from Southeast Asia possible. I think for about 3 years in a row, about 22,000 Vietnamese came to Australia. Not necessarily all refugees, some of them by then might have been family reunions, but it was large numbers. And it was possible because there were regional agreements with Malaysia and Indonesia, and there was the knowledge that other refugee-taking countries, the United States and Canada, also took a great number, and France did. I don't know that she was part of any formal arrangement, but from old association, about 90,000 refugees went from Vietnam to China, to France. You know, the stories I hear at that time are mostly ones of families in Adelaide producing clothes for children, toys for children. They're not shut away behind barbed wire. They can go and buy a cup of coffee. They're able to get jobs. They apply to become Australians. I ran into a young man the other day who said, I came here in my mother's arms, and as I grew up, we made up our mind that one member of the family should try and repay something to Australia. When he was speaking to me, he was a lieutenant in the Air Force. I think Australia has gained enormously from the contribution of Vietnamese migration to this country.
Now, obviously, we know the society held together, but if you'd taken an opinion poll at the time, you would have got a majority no.
There are some things in which, you won't like this in the audience, I'm sorry, but there are some things that governments have to do, and you can't ask people first. A very simple one, if tax is going to go up, even by 1%, everyone will vote no. We know that. Nobody will ever vote for an increase in taxes. But if Arthur Corwood had said in 1947 or 1948, the migration program is likely to make Melbourne the biggest Greek city outside of Greece. Do you approve it or not? I suspect 90% of Anglo-Saxon Melbourne would have voted no. But if you took that vote today, now that it's happened, I would like to think that 95% would vote a resounding yes, with a sense of gratitude for the contribution that Greeks have made to the city of Melbourne and the contribution they've made to Australia. So when you're talking about people who come from a different country, it's very hard to get, you've really got to make the decision on the basis of what you think is right, and then have the courage to argue for it. I made quite a number of speeches saying why we were allowing Vietnamese refugees and immigrants into Australia. And I never felt the pressure. If there was any, it sort of passed me by. I never felt it because I believed it was the only decent and honourable thing to do, the only ethical thing to do, and especially so as a consequence of the Vietnam War.
And but in the context of the times that you governed, politicians of your generation and the politicians before you were informed by a couple of seismic events, the Great Depression and the Second World War, and the sense that Australia had national interest in increasing its population while also diversifying its content, probably governed both sides of politics. There's a sense, and, my sort of political awareness in the Canberra Press Gallery started in 1988. The only things that we've ever argued about is how far to deregulate. There isn't the same sense, I think, with the politicians of this generation that as much is at stake on some of the decisions they have to take. Do you think that might explain why we've lost the bipartisanship, say, on the issue of race? Notwithstanding the fact that John Howard was obviously of of that generation as well.
Only just. I would like to think that the sort of attitude that was exhibited over the first 30 or 40 years post-war would be exhibited in any responsible national parliament. And if we are going to say that we will only get sensible decisions from our politicians if they've been through a Great Depression, if they've been through 6 years of a war in which civilization as we know it and understand it has nearly been destroyed, if that's the only way you can get sensible decisions, then God help the human race.
Can I just say something about this, George?
Yeah, sorry.
I think we lose the sense when we look back on what the Fraser government did with the refugees, we lose the sense of how contested it was at the time. It's certainly the case that it was bipartisan politically, but I think one of the most, if you can get moved going through archival files, and it is difficult, but one of the most moving parts of that job was to see the advice that was coming to the Fraser cabinet from the bureaucracy, which was saying we need a reception centre in a remote part of Australia where these people can be locked up and kept away. We need to consider turning boats back. All these ideas were there and were served up not once but several times to the Fraser cabinet and consistently rejected.
Quickly too.
Some
of the immigration advice you got at the time would have lasted all of 10 seconds on
but the idea of compulsory detention, the idea of treating refugees severely, of failing to acknowledge Australia's international obligations were all very much in play, and it would have been very easy for this government to have behaved differently, but it didn't.
Now, another big thing in the 70s, we'll go back to a couple more domestic issues in a minute, the relationship with America, and it fascinates me reading back through the sections on international affairs. My memory, and it's a very young memory of the era, is that the US alliance card was always played against the Labor Party, but I get a sense from Malcolm Fraser reading, with the benefit of hindsight, that maybe the US alliance wasn't all it was cracked up to be.
The alliance was important, and was played against the Labor Party, I suppose, because of the hangover of the Evatt days and things past, and a very real fear of communism, the known ideological divisions between the political parties. The left would fear, workers would fear what the bosses and the largely represented, they thought, by the Liberal Party were going to do, and a lot of other people would fear And there were very real fears of a communist takeover in Australia in the 40s. The PKI coup in Indonesia was in 61, I think. The last takeover of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union was 68. The Russians had started moving flotillas of ships around Australia and into the Indian Ocean much more obviously than they ever had before. So in these days, the Soviet Union, I believe, was an outward-looking and aggressive power, and there was a lot of evidence to support that. Playing it against the Labour Party, I think, was as much as anything because of the way some members of the Labour Party played, and the self-denying ordinance didn't go to this basic and fundamental ideological difference, because the common interpretation of socialism was the same end result as communism, but one done by force, one done
to the ballot box.
To the ballot box.
Mm. But in your dealings with the US, of course, I see a bit of tension all the way through the narrative. In your days in Defence Minister, obviously informed by the Vietnam War, there was a lot of expectation on Australia as an ally, but in power, in government, the quid pro quo never came. I mean, the Americans always assessed things on their own terms, within their own interests, and I think the disillusionment might have happened pretty quickly for you.
You never win brownie points with a superpower or with a major power. And I'd classify most of the countries of Europe as major powers, certainly the big 4 or 6. With the United States, we were concerned, the Australian Army, I believe, was concerned with what was happening in Vietnam, but the statements of generals were always very confident. They repeated those horrible body counts. They'd say, give us more troops, a new strategy, and we'll win. Well, that's what they're saying in Afghanistan now. But in Vietnam, there were 650,000 Americans. I think 130,000 is in Afghanistan, plus some NATO forces. But I believed, as a result of the Vietnam War, and I certainly believe still, that we should not be fighting a war alongside our allies, the United States, unless we have one of our own people in the war councils when that war is discussed. So we know the strategy, we know the approaches. Now, the British were able to put somebody from Australia in that position. The Americans never have been, and I suspect never will. But to me, it is something that would be very important. I'd had furious arguments with the Americans over defence matters and over the F-111 aircraft, where for a while it looked as if we were going to be forced to take a machine that will be no use to us.
And pay top dollar for it.
And pay top dollar, of course. But then, by grace of God, something happened, and we were able to get a revised contract that protected Australia's interest. But it had nothing to do with me. It was just, I was in Washington at a time when the United States Senate was going to hold an inquiry into the F-111. And I had the idea of taking Arthur Tang and defence scientists who had been at Fort Worth, where the machine was being built and tested, up to the Capitol Hill and giving evidence before that Senate inquiry. And the Senate thought this would be a wonderful thing to do. And it was only to stop that we got an agreement to have a contract that protected Australia's interests. Not because we'd helped America in Vietnam, not because we'd helped them in a number of other circumstances, simply because, as their Secretary of Defence put it, Laird, well, if you go up there, Malcolm, they'll cut off our money straight away and we won't get an aircraft. And I said, well, that's fine. Then I won't owe you a cent and we'll sue you for the money we've already paid you.